Hello and welcome to Face to Face. I'm Anna Kalczyńska, and joining me tonight is Adam Yasser, Deputy Director for News, TVP World. Good evening, Adam.
Good evening.
Auschwitz survivors and world leaders arrived in Poland on Monday to mark the 80th anniversary of liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, which Germans set up in occupied Poland during World War II. And the ceremony was attended by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky, Britain's King Charles, French President Emmanuel Macron, Polish President Andrzej Duda, and a host of other world leaders and European royalty. So virtually on the eve of these ceremonies, remembering the Holocaust of European Jews, Elon Musk, who is an advisor to President Donald Trump, joined a rally by Germany's Alternative für Deutschland party, which has a history of justifying the Nazis. And speaking to AfD supporters 4 weeks only ahead of the German elections, which is important, he called for creation of what he called a great Germany and told the cheering audience their country should cast away its guilt for Nazi crimes. So what do you make of it?
It seems that Mr. Musk's desire to be a contrarian and the destroyer of the old establishment, as he wants to see it, has no limits, and he's prepared to do things which are an embarrassment at the end of the day for him and for the United States. And of course, this is very dangerous in a sense that, he's glorifying pure power. If anything, Auschwitz is a reminder where that leads to. Sooner or later, if you glorify raw power at the expense of human rights or dignity or conscience, you end up with war and death. And let's remember that 60 million people lost their lives during the Second World War. Started very often with similar narratives about glory, about rebuilding, about unity of nation. Words matter, they turn into action later.
It begins with pride and power, but would you have imagined that a Polish Prime Minister would have to remind the world about history? Poles are especially sensitive to the issue of the Second World War. We saw 6 million of our compatriots dying, perishing during this time. So these kind of words, just one day ahead of the commemoration of such an anniversary, is it just coincidence or maybe a provocation? What is the aim of Elon Musk after all?
It's a little hard to read him at the moment, apart from the fact that he seems to pay very little regard to what he says and what he does, apart from stirring things up. And yes, you're right, the Polish Prime Minister reminded the world and Elon Musk at this anniversary that, it still matters. The generation of people who lived during the war, survived the war, or who had the memory of the war, they're fading away, and we saw this during these celebrations. Fewer and fewer survivors attend these ceremonies every year. And as this generation passes away, and the generation that came after, but was still scarred by the war, they realize how dangerous this game is. But for many people, this is becoming a thing of the past, distant history, and it probably gives people like Musk, who are fascinated by power, by strength, the ability to ignore it. But I think they're doing it at their peril. The paradox of all this is that parties like the AfD in Germany, they claim to be anti-establishment. They want to break Europe apart, and they want to restore Europe's glory. How on earth is that possible if a divided Europe will be no match for the new powers, be it China, be it the new imperialist US or Russia? So division is certainly not going to help Europe weather the changing geopolitical situation. So to me, the celebration of AfD and AfD's celebration of Musk, it's like turkeys which are celebrating Christmas.
So what is important also to understand is what impact could it have possibly on the German society? Does it fall on a fertile ground?
That is the experiment that we're witnessing, and we'll see. In 4 weeks' time there will be an election in Germany, And we'll see whether Mr. Musk's endorsement is actually that influential. I have a sense, but it's based on just a sliver of opinion polls, that it actually is going to be counterproductive. To many people, regardless of their views, such blatant intervention by a billionaire who is pushing his own economic interests first into political debate in Britain or now in Germany, it's just too much. So we'll see.
I would like to recall also Neil Ferguson, a British historian, who recently in Davos remarked that Germany caused far too many wars in Europe not to take responsibility for the continent's peace right now. So after all, maybe Elon Musk is right. Maybe we need this sense of pride of Germany and their ability to act.
The entire trouble with Elon Musk is that very often he will say things which ring true. And the fact that Germany isn't doing enough and hasn't been doing enough to contribute to peace in Europe through strength, that's true. But let's take a look at the context of what Mr. Ferguson said at Davos. He was referring to a sentence by a veteran German diplomat who suggested in the same conversation at Davos that it should be the Chinese troops that should be sent to Ukraine to guarantee peace. And that triggered Neil Ferguson, and he rightly pointed out that it's another example of some people in Germany, part of the old establishment, is just trying to avoid taking responsibility for securing peace in Europe. But the bottom line on all this is that there is no contradiction between Germany remembering its past and remembering the crimes of the Nazi period and guaranteeing peace. And in fact, even the current German government and possibly the next German government are now openly talking about sending troops to Ukraine to secure peace, not just as peacekeepers in blue helmets, but a proper force. So Germany is already moving there, and Mr. Musk is just promoting a party which actually doesn't want to send troops to secure peace in Ukraine. So Musk is exposing in this his stupidity, basically. He doesn't really understand the situation. He doesn't understand that AfD certainly doesn't stand for European peace and for enforcing European peace. So Neil Ferguson is talking about a completely different Germany than Mr. Musk is.
Right, about Boris Pistorius and Annalisa Baerbock, and not about AfD.
And the potential future chancellor, Mr. Merz, there seems to be a consensus now in Germany that sooner or later, when there is peace in Ukraine, German troops will be there helping an international force to maintain it.
Let's hope that Friedrich Merz is going to take lessons from the history and interpret it this way. Let's now move, Adam, to another issue, very important. The sanctions on Russia have been finally adopted, accepted by European Union. However, Prime Minister Donald Tusk, when Orban's decision wasn't still certain, wrote on X, and let me quote him: "If Viktor Orban really blocks European sanctions at a key moment for the war, it will be absolutely clear that in this big game for the security and future of Europe, he's playing in Putin's team, not in ours." So does that mean that Viktor Orban changed his mind under the influence of one of these tweets, perhaps, or influence of Donald Tusk's?
I doubt he changed his mind under the influence of Donald Tusk's words. He just backed down because we need to mention the fact that in the end Hungary did not block these sanctions,
yes,
right? And in the end they will be extended, sanctions on Russia. So he was traditionally playing his cards until the last moment. But in reality, America is now threatening sanctions on Russia to bring Putin to the negotiating table. And it would be highly improbable for Hungary to be able to stand alone in this. Mm-hmm. And the European nations would have found a different way of sanctioning Russia. So Prime Minister Tusk clarified what is at stake and what is Mr. Orban's game. But I think Mr. Orban is still in shock that the US administration that he believed would bring immediate peace, more or less on Moscow's terms, is now prepared to play it hard with Putin and threatening sanctions. So, it wasn't... So Mr. Orban was risking becoming isolated, not just in Europe, but also within the broader Western community, including the United States.
Does that further weaken Fidesz and Viktor Orban?
He's increasingly looking vulnerable because many of his ploys seem not to be working. And his hope that the change of administration in the United States is going to unleash some revolution in Europe. Yes, Mr. Musk is trying to achieve that, but just as we discussed, it doesn't have to happen in the first place. And second, if that happens, Hungary will end up as a small country in Central Europe exposed to powers which are much bigger than the country. So there's just no way why that would be useful for Hungary. And I think this is at the core of why Hungarians now increasingly looking to a different party to lead them in the future.
Because Fidesz is falling in the polls.
And Fidesz is now trailing behind the opposition. So he's still dancing, but the music seems to be stopping.
So Ukraine is ready to transit gas from Azerbaijan to Europe. Is it Zelensky's gesture of goodwill?
I think the question of Azeri gas to Europe was never in doubt when it comes to passage through Ukraine. And, at the end of the day, there is always a risk that this is going to be Russian gas pretending to be Azeri gas traveling through Ukraine. So it's a question of enforcement, of monitoring. I was once told by an expert on these pipelines and gas from different sources, once in the pipeline, you can't tell if it's a Russian particle of gas or if it's an Azeri particle of gas. So yes, there is a problem. But Zelensky politically sticks to his word that he will stop Russian gas exports through the Ukrainian territory. And it is now up to other parties. And as we hear, the European Commission is going to talk to the Azeris and to the Ukrainians. So maybe some kind of a regime of importing and verifying Azeri gas is possible, which, as you rightly point out, will be some sort of compromise.
And as we hear from Zelensky, we can use our infrastructure if countries in Europe need gas, but it's going to be Azeri gas, not Russian. That's what he said. Let's now move on to Serbia. Another massive 24-hour protest in Belgrade today. Last week we saw a general strike, which was called by the youth, not politically affiliated. So we still really don't understand exactly who is behind those protests. We don't see a face, we don't have a name. Yet the protests don't show any sign of stopping, and the resolve is there. So where is it heading for? Because we observe sort of a tug of a war.
As far as I can see, everyone is asking this question, where this is heading.
Yes.
Because on the one hand, as you rightly point out, these protests have been going on for weeks now, and they seem to be becoming bigger and bigger. We saw workers and healthcare workers joining the students.
Even the public television.
The public television, which has been accused of being a propaganda machine for the government. So, something is happening, but as you rightly point out, at the moment, we don't see a clear leader. What's more, we don't really understand what the demands are. So at face value, the demands of the students and those who support their protest is transparency, accountability of government, and less corruption.
Right.
These are all good demands, but it's not clear what they really expect. Do they want a change of government? Do they want new elections? Some of them are talking about new elections. But then the next question is the student movement going to morph into a political force like Solidarity Union in Poland, 30 years ago? Or is it going to disperse? So the judgment is out, but the government is clearly under pressure. And I think the initial hopes of President Vučić that he can just wait it out, they don't seem to be working.
Well, Vučić says that the situation is not going to be decided on the streets in Serbia, but during the elections.
Well, is he prepared to call an early election? Probably not. This government is relatively fresh into its new term. So if he agreed to early elections, that would already be a huge victory for this movement. But then the next question is, can the opposition and the students unite, given that the students seem very reluctant to engage with the existing opposition parties, which are broadly perceived as divided, not very charismatic, and so on and so forth. So,
Yeah.
you know, in a vacuum, you need a force, you need a leader, as you rightly pointed out. For the time being, we don't see that, but you never know. This is a dynamic situation. My favorite saying is events, dear boy, events. So we'll see in the weeks to come. Maybe such a leader will emerge.
Exactly. It's difficult also to understand why one of the comment voiced by a representative of the American administration, Richard Grenell, U.S. envoy for special missions, doesn't exactly voice support for these demonstrators. We hear from him, if you don't like a law or a leader, then work to change it, but don't resort to violence. We do not support those who undermine the rule of law or who forcefully take over the government buildings. What do you make of this?
Well, you know, I think Mr. Grenell should use some of his advice to deal with some of the things that are happening in the US now. The question of the rule of law and sticking to the constitutional order, big question marks when it comes to the new US administration. So it's interesting that a representative of the US government would choose such a moment to side with the government, which is clearly avoiding accountability. So I don't think this advice is going to be heeded by anyone in Belgrade.
In the same time, massive pro-EU protests in Slovakia, something that we haven't seen since the power be taken over by Robert Fico. So this is a huge rise of protests against the Russian stance of Robert Fico. So what direction is Slovakia heading in your mind? Is it a sign of a fragmentation, of a polarization of the society?
My take, my personal, and I'm stressing that this is my personal interpretation, is that some of these leaders in Europe that were counting on some kind of a revolution inside Europe, changing the way Europe functions and becoming friendlier with Russia and continuing economic relationship with Russia, they are now in trouble. So this includes Mr. Orban, this includes Mr. Fico, because first of all, Europe is, the remaining EU countries, most Europe remains steadfast in its support for Ukraine and sanctions on Russia. So their hope that gas will start flowing, cheap gas is going to start flowing to their countries is misplaced. Second, many of these leaders have promised that when they gain power, and Mr. Fico is in power just about a year now, that they will change everything, improve the economy, that living conditions will improve, and that they will really rock Europe. Well, not much of this materialized. So Slovakia is still suffering economically, not just because of the Russian gas sanctions, but also because its economic model based on auto production primarily is facing a crisis due to cheap Chinese imports, but also because Mr. Trump is threatening tariffs of European cars. So Slovakia, which was perhaps hoping, like Mr. Orban, that Mr. Trump's accession to power will be a turning point for Slovakia, may actually be on the receiving end of this, and Slovakia may suffer economically further down the road. So to cut a long story short, he failed to force Ukraine to restore Russian gas imports through its territory. He alienated most of the European leaders. He went to Moscow negotiating with Putin about gas. Then he disappeared for 2 weeks. And then he's acting really weird. And it's becoming so visible and so obnoxious that people are coming out to protest against him.
All right. So now, just for the record, Adam, to sum up, Alexander Lukashenko amassed 87.6% of the vote during his so-called presidential presidential operation, rather, we should call it. The other candidates won between 1% and 3% of the vote. The turnout, 50%. Couldn't he forged more, you think?
He could, but it doesn't really matter. It's a dictatorship, and let's call spade a spade. It's a dictatorship. There is no. These were not elections. This was a sham election, completely staged from beginning to end. It just allows him to hold on to power as a dictator, and I think Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is, as far as we can tell, the legitimate president, rightly called it a special election operation, and it's not going to change much. Unfortunately for the Belarusians who seem to crave freedom, crave to become part of Europe, as long as Putin is in power in Moscow, it will be very hard to dislodge Mr. Lukashenko through democratic means.
Adam, thank you so much for your insights tonight, for the large expertise, and
Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching. That's all we've prepared for you in this episode of Face to Face. Join us again on Friday, and in the meantime, please stay tuned to TVP World for more news and analysis. See you soon.